All right, friends. So last time we left off by talking about which materials we think have low friction and are slippery, and we wanted to name some materials with low friction. So you may have come up with a few ideas. Today we're going to test out some ideas that you might have had.
How could you figure out which solid materials cause the least friction and which ones cause the most friction? Your teacher has a few different materials for you to test out today.
Okay, so obviously I'm not with you. So I gathered some random materials around my house. You're going to want to gather some random materials as well. You can use any of the ideas that Doug put on the screen. I grabbed a piece of chalk, a bottle cap, a guitar pick, napkin, money, sticky note, and a nickel. Those were some examples that I grabbed. Make sure you pause the video now and grab maybe 5 or 6 different materials that you would like to test out. Okay, pause the video. Okay, hopefully you have the materials that you need. We're going to keep going with the lesson.
It's totally up to you to figure out how to test them. I'll give you this little bit of guidance. If we use an actual slide to test these materials, there's going to be a lot of students all lining up and waiting. So instead of using an actual slide, we can make a model of a slide by propping up a piece of cardboard against a stack of books. Scientists often make models when doing an experiment for the same reason that you're going to make a model of a slide, because sometimes it's easier to test a model than it is to test the real thing. I would also recommend turning each of your materials into a little slider that you can use on your model slide. We could think of a slider as like a model of a person going down the slide, like this. Now, there are some tips on how to make a slider on the handout you'll get. So that's my only guidance to you. Work in a small group to set up a model of a slide and to make your sliders. Once you and your group have all that set up, your group should spend like 5 or 10 minutes trying out some different ideas. There are a lot of things you can experiment with, like how steep you make the slide. Or you could experiment with how many pennies you put on each slider as weight. Or how many sliders you test at one time. These are all different possibilities you can experiment with. Try out a few different methods. All right, here's what you need to get started. You're going to need a try this worksheet and pencil, a piece of stiff cardboard to use as your slide, some tape, some pennies for weights, a stack of books or blocks that can be used to prop up the top of the slide, and a few different materials to test, like sandpaper and styrofoam, smooth plastic, cardboard, paper, and metal. All right, go ahead and prepare your sliders and your slide, and then spend 5 or 10 minutes trying out some different ideas, just as practice. When you're done with that, you can all get back together as a class and talk about what you noticed and what ideas you came up with.
All right, time to go try out some ideas. Hey. Hey.
How could you figure out which solid materials cause the least?
There we go. So when you're done, after 10 minutes or so, we're going to put our materials off to the side and then see the next questions on the next slide. So at this time, you can go ahead and gather all of the materials you need. If you don't have access to a printer, it's okay. You don't have to print out these worksheets. They're just extra. So you can see maybe that I made my own little slider here. I stacked a couple of books. I have a honeycomb box that I cut up as my slider. And then I'll be able to test out my different materials. See what works. Okay, so go ahead and grab your materials, pause the video, take about 10 minutes to test it out, and then we'll come back together and try some things together. All right, have fun. Okay, now that you have had a chance to test out your materials, we're going to discuss a couple of questions together. The first one is what happens when you put all of the sliders on the slide when it's flat, and then slowly raise one end of the slide. Pause the video and test that out. All right, let's see what happened when Doug did it. He said, when we tried this, some sliders moved when the slide was just a little slanted, and some didn't move until it was really steep. Did the same thing happen when you tried it? For me, yes. My nickel moved as soon as I started lifting it, but my sticky note took a really long time to start moving. Interesting. Okay, number 2. What happens when you race a cardboard slider with 5 pennies against one with no pennies? So I didn't do this activity because I didn't use cardboard sliders, but if you did something different happen when you used 5 pennies versus 1 penny as weight? Doug says when we tried this, the slider with 5 pennies won. That makes sense, right? Because it's heavier. That's what I would have guessed as well. And last but not least, what questions did you come up with? What happens when you experimented to answer them? Did you have questions as you were making it? And did you experiment to try and answer them? There are many possibilities here. If you had trouble coming up with questions, don't worry. Asking good questions is a skill. You'll get better at it with practice. We do it in reading and writing. We do it all sorts of places. In science, it's also important. All right. Let's go ahead and pause the video here. Okay, actually, we're going to go ahead and watch the last portion of this video, which kind of explains which materials really do have less friction. So we get our answer to our mystery. Check it out.
Now that you built your model and sliders and you had some time to discuss your different ideas as a class, it's time to figure out for sure exactly which materials create the least friction as they slide down a slide. Before you start, I thought I'd show you a couple different methods that we came up with here at Mystery Science, in case you decide you want to try one of our methods. First, we experimented with some different weights. We had 1 penny, 2 pennies, and 5 pennies. Now, I'm not sure what you found, but we found that 2 pennies worked well. That gave the sliders enough weight for the pull of gravity to make them move. We also made sure that each slider had the same number of pennies, so that way it would be a fair test. We thought it might not be a fair test if some sliders had more weight than other sliders. So then we figured out how steep our slide had to be to make all of our sliders start sliding. We lined all the sliders up behind a ruler, and then what we decided to do was let them loose all at the same time, kind of like letting runners line up at a marathon, you know? On your mark, get set, go! Just like that. And the idea here is that the first one to reach the bottom must have the least friction. So we watched to see which slider ran off the end of the slide first. Notice I'm not going to give it away here. I don't want to spoil it for you. I'm not going to show you what happened. So this was one method we came up with. Now, this is not the only way to do a test. We tried another method that worked well too. And here it is. We put the sliders on the slide when it was flat. And then we lifted the end of the slide 1 inch at a time. When it was lifted 1 inch, none of them moved. So we lifted it another inch. Still nothing. Inch by inch, we lifted it until we saw, which slider started to move. And so we made a note of how high up the slide was and what the slider was made of. So those are the 2 methods that we tried. But you guys might have come up with something totally different that worked just as well. The truth is, there's no single right way to do this. We could come up with a couple other ways that would have worked too. So now that you as a class have talked about the different ideas you came up with and you heard our ideas too, go ahead and decide on one way, one method that you'll use. Your teacher will hand out the design a test sheet now. Work with your group to make decisions, perform your test, and fill in the sheet as you go. Good luck.
All right, a claim is a statement that you think is true. Who wants to make a claim about which material has the most friction? That's the one that slides the worst. What's your evidence, and does anyone want to make a different claim? So what was your worst friction item? Mine was probably the sticky note. It did not do a very good job of sliding. So to me, this one has the most friction because it didn't slide well. All right, who wants to make a claim about which material had the least friction? What's your evidence? So for me, the nickel had the least friction because as soon as I lifted the cardboard up, it went zoop right down the slide. So to me, that means it doesn't have a lot of friction. What did you find? And last but not least, if you had time in the future to do more friction experiments, what would you do differently? What other tests would you want to try? Now, since you're at home, you have the ability. If you want to change it up a little bit, you have the time to do it. So experiment with it, try it out, see what you can come up with. that's all for today. Thanks, friends, for enjoying this sliding experiment with me. Hopefully you learned a little bit about friction.